Hey, it's Kay, and this is Skittles, Architect. In the 1700s, the English legal system was crude. Serious offenders would face the gallows, while those convicted of lesser crimes might be publicly flogged or put in stocks to be basically abused by the public. This is often depicted humorously in media, but if you think about it for a second, it's actually kind of terrifying. Needless to say, people died from this fairly often. Another popular punishment was transportation. While Australia would become much more famous for being the recipient of this practice, for decades, the British dumped their convicts in America, aiding in colonization, providing cheap labor, because chattel slavery apparently wasn't enough for these creeps, and importantly, just getting these convicts out of Britain so they didn't have to deal with them anymore. That is, until 1775, when transportation to America was no longer an option for, some reason. Transportation to Australia wouldn't start up for over a decade, and by the time it did, it simply wouldn't be enough to deal with the surging number of convicts the British legal system was churning out, as it reformed to meet the needs of an urbanizing industrial society, which is a polite way of saying they made it easier to convict the poor for the crime of being poor, on account of industrialization producing so much poverty. And so the greatest minds of Britain, which in a reasonable country would have been exiled from civilization as dangerous perverts, rather than listened to for public policy, came up with a solution to all these convicts that had nowhere to go. What if we just lock them all in a big building and don't let them leave? The idea was a hit, especially when people started to realize that you could make these prisoners work, and you wouldn't have to pay them, because you stripped them of what few pesky rights a worker in the 18th and 19th centuries could be said to have. Now, prisons have existed since antiquity in some form. Early 18th century British prisons were not dissimilar to Roman or many medieval prisons. They were basically huge, overcrowded dungeons that served as vectors of disease, and, with all the prisoners gathered in one place, lent itself to prison riots. Reformers like Jeremy Bentham, inventor of the single most poignant and overused image of state surveillance, the panopticon, stressed the need not just to contain prisoners, but to control them. Thankfully, Bentham's panopticon was never exactly built, but the ideas he and other prison reformers put forward contributed to a series of reforms that led to every prisoner being kept in their own individual cell. But not in the way that the average prisoner is today. They were kept in that cell all day, every day. They were maybe given an hour a day out of the cell, and it was also alone. When prisoners were to move around outside their cell, they would wear masks so as to be unable to communicate with or identify each other. Total isolation. This is the origin of solitary confinement. This model of imprisonment was swiftly abandoned due to, and I quote, driving the prisoners insane. Around the same time, some Quaker sickos in America also tried keeping prisoners in solitary confinement and quickly came to that same conclusion. So why is it that on any given day, 50,000 people are in solitary confinement in the United States alone? This video required a lot of research, but I enjoyed doing it because learning about things that matter to you is really satisfying. That's why this video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant.org is a great way to learn math, or as the British call it, maths, as well as computer science interactively, whatever your current level is. Brilliant has thousands of lessons, and new ones are added every month. Something that I like about Brilliant is the little bite-sized lessons are perfectly designed for busy people, like if you're trying to stay on top of a YouTube channel, 2 podcasts, a degree, and a job. It's fine. I've been trying to get my head around the basics of coding for longer than I am willing to admit online, and Brilliant's great intuitive coding lessons have actually broken through my Luddite skull. Brilliant helps build your analytical skills so that when you see a problem, you have the tools to solve it yourself. Soon I'll be rotating PDFs with the best of them. To try Brilliant out completely free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/KandSkittles or click on the link in the description. And the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Now that's a brilliant idea. Huh? Is that something? You like that? Back to the video. Solitary confinement as practiced today is the 24/7 confinement of prisoners to a cell like this. Sometimes with an hour or so outside their cell, alone. Yeah, it's about the same as when it started. This social isolation is both physically and psychologically destructive to the victim. The symptoms of prolonged solitary confinement include chronic headaches, eyesight deterioration, digestive problems, dizziness, excessive sweating, fatigue and lethargy, genitourinary heart palpitations, hypersensitivity to light and noise, loss of appetite, muscle and joint sleep pain, problems, trembling hands, weight loss, anxiety and stress, depression and hopelessness, anger, irritability and hostility, panic attacks, worsened pre-existing mental health hypersensitivity to sounds and problems smells, with attention, concentration, hallucinations that affect all of the senses, paranoia, poor impulse control, social withdrawal, outbursts of violence, psychosis, fear of death, self-harm, or suicide. Former inmate Anthony Graves, who was, after 18 years, exonerated and found to be wrongfully convicted, describes the impact solitary confinement had on inmates. I would watch guys come to prison totally sane, and in 3 years, they don't live in the real world anymore, he said. One fellow inmate, Graves said, would go out into the recreation yard, get naked, lie down, and urinate all over himself. He would take his feces and smear it all over his face. Graves himself spent a decade in solitary confinement and says he can't sleep normally and even years after his release is prone to mood swings and complete emotional breakdowns. Solitary confinement destroys people. It is torture. Don't take it from me. The UN classifies it as torture. Any prisoner advocacy group you can think of classifies it as torture. In academia, it is so rare to have the kind of consensus you'll find around solitary confinement. But it is pretty much unanimously regarded as torture. Or at the very least, so severely harmful and detrimental to the well-being of prisoners that there aren't really any serious arguments in favor of it, other than just suggesting that the horror of it serves as some deterrent, an argument with very little evidence behind it. Craig Haney, a social psychologist at the University of California, highlights that California's especially aggressive policy of placing gang members in solitary confinement has not reduced the gang violence in their prisons. If anything, it has worsened it. That shit is torture, and on top of that, the psychological damage it does to people makes it more difficult for them to function in a prison environment, making them a greater hazard to themselves and others, and making them far, far less capable of later adjusting to life outside prison. In other words, solitary confinement reduces the probability of rehabilitation, making it totally antithetical to the purpose of the justice system. Unless rehabilitation isn't what the justice system is for. If you've heard even the shallowest critique of the American prison system, you probably know that rehabilitation isn't its strong suit. Punishment is. American prisons are notoriously violent, unsafe, and abusive as far as the first world goes, as well as sporting some of the longest sentences. When people finally get out of American prisons, 76.6% of them are rearrested within 5 years. The recidivism rate in the United States is staggering, and it's hardly any surprise. The entire country is designed to make life as difficult as possible for you, even after you've supposedly served your time in prison. Being able to find a job after prison is a huge factor in determining if somebody reoffends, and employers can discriminate against you for having a criminal record. According to the Bureau of Justice, only 12.5% of employers said they would accept an application from an ex-convict. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. You can't vote. You can be denied housing. You can't apply for federal grants. There's a huge online database called the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction, which not only rolls off the tongue, but lists, at time of recording, 43,863 laws throughout the United States that deny you access to something based on ever having been convicted. Quite a lot of it is employment opportunities, and most of it is permanent. How the fuck are you supposed to be a law-abiding member of society under all these conditions? By the way, if you're released on parole, often you have to pay for your own supervision by the state. And you better be able to make rent, because in many states, becoming homeless constitutes a parole violation. And if it doesn't, quite a few of the things like public sleeping and begging that homeless people often have to do are criminalized and can violate your parole as well. So you better find some way to get money quick, bucko. Gee, I wonder how that number got so fucking high. The argument has been made strongly and repeatedly for longer than I've been alive. The American prison system simply does not rehabilitate criminals. It seemingly exists to make their lives as miserable as possible. It is a punitive institution. Therefore, arguing that solitary confinement is contradictory to the goals of rehabilitation and is needlessly cruel is kind of missing the forest for the trees. This normalized torture of prisoners is entirely in line with the intended goals of the prison system. So, returning to the question of why this is still happening, is this a situation like universal healthcare, where actually the majority of Americans want things to be done differently, but the wealthy business and political interests that profit from the current system are simply imposing their own will on the populace? Well, that's a tricky one. When people are surveyed asking whether they believe the point of the prison system should be rehabilitation or punishment, they consistently say rehabilitation. Case closed. People don't want a punitive justice system, and the way the current justice system works is entirely forced upon us by the ruling class against our own demands, right? Well, here's the thing about survey data. People are not machines. We're not always able to objectively describe and categorize all of our opinions clearly. And we are capable of holding deeply contradictory views at the same time. When surveys and focus group research is carried out asking more precise questions, respondents consistently paint a very different and very punitive picture. In a 2014 study which asked people how they perceive the living conditions in prisons, a strong majority believed life in prison was harsh. Their conditions were bad. However, 46.6% of them believed that the prison environment should be even harsher. And 41.6% said it is fine the way it is, meaning that many of those 88% of respondents acknowledge that living conditions in prisons are bad and think that's a good thing. Does that sound like people really value rehabilitation over punishment? Research by Univer and Cullen can add even more context to this. They found that people's desire for punitive measures correlates strongly to how deserving they think a prisoner is of punishment. Whether their crime was violent or not, whether they're perceived as being fully to blame for their crime, or more of a victim of circumstances, whether they're perceived as more or less likely to reoffend. And you may not be surprised to hear that Black and Latino prisoners were much more likely to be perceived as more at fault for their crimes, more inherently bad for what they've done, and therefore more deserving of punitive treatment. These attitudes are consistently reflected in survey data. People think murderers and rapists should be treated more severely than petty thieves or some guy who got locked up for having weed on him. But often, they're all in the same prison. Supporters of punitive justice are quick to cite the ever-present murderers and rapists to attack any calls for improved conditions in prisons, shorter sentencing, or even finding solutions to many crimes that don't involve locking someone in a cage for a huge portion of their life. Well, people convicted for those two crimes make up just over a quarter of prisoners, and yet they are centered in the rhetoric around prison to support policies that will hurt everyone else in there too. By the way, Look out for statistics citing violent offenders, because the US justice system categorizes a ton of non-violent crimes as violent, including burglary, even if it's an empty house. Judging by opinions on how prisons should be, it seems that people imagine the many people locked up for minor offenses to be an outlier, and the archetypical dangerous criminal who is just dying to kill again the second he can as the most common type of prisoner. So again, appeals to how horrible solitary confinement just aren't that effective, because despite what we say when we're asked whether prison should be rehabilitative or punitive, people want to feel like the bad men are suffering. They want prisons to be harsh. Now, this is conjecture, but I suspect a significant number of the responses to that first survey that asked if prison should be punitive or rehabilitative were just down to it feeling really silly to say out loud, I think the point of prisons should be to punish people, not actually reduce crime. It's just so childish. You need to dress it up somehow to give it some moral legitimacy. Otherwise, it's just a ridiculous opinion to have, isn't it? People who argue for punitive justice and harsher sentencing often cite the victims of crimes as their justification. They're doing it to bring justice to those who have been wronged. See, doesn't that sound more noble than making the bad men suffer so I can feel good? It's a compelling argument. I know if someone had harmed me, I would want there to be consequences. It's about more than just what's the most logical or has the best societal outcome. I don't want to live in a world where someone can just do something awful to me and get away with it. I think that's a really common and sensible response. But that doesn't have to mean maximizing the suffering of the person who committed the crime. In fact, most victims of crimes don't want that at all. In a survey of victims of crimes, a strong majority preferred shorter sentences, more investment in social programs that prevent crime, accountability via systems other than prison, and 52% think prison actually makes people more likely to commit crimes, with only 19% saying they think prison helps rehabilitate people. Victims of crimes are actually more critical of prison and more supportive of rehabilitative justice than the general population. So if you're calling for harsher treatment of prisoners, be honest with yourself. You're doing it for you. It feels good to imagine that people who do bad things are punished for it. That feels like some kind of justice. But it's just a feeling, and it doesn't solve anything, and it shouldn't determine policy. The summer of 2020 had a substantial impact on how the American public thinks about policing and prison. More recent surveys have found an increasingly humane attitude towards non-violent offenders. Remember what we said about that. With support for shorter sentences and non-prison rehabilitative programs. But when it comes to the specter of the serious violent offender, opinions are sadly pretty unchanged. 55% of Americans still support the death penalty for murderers as of 2022. It's a slight decline because the crime hysteria of the 80s and 90s saw that number balloon, but it's a minor change and isn't very different from how it's been for most of the last century. As a result, opponents of prison reform only need to say those magic words. What about the murderers and rapists? And they can torpedo support for policies that are proven to make society safer. Public support for solitary confinement has actually tanked. But fear of serious violent crime, something that is incredibly uncommon in most people's lives, is effectively weaponized time and time again to turn public support against reforms that would actually make changes that are in line with what the public, according to surveys, claims to believe. This is perhaps best demonstrated by the American response to Norway's prison system. Infamous for being soft on crime because Norwegian prisons seek to replicate normal life, rather than forcing prisoners to adjust to abnormal institutional life. So they don't feel like what we expect prison to feel like. When people exit Norwegian prisons, they are far less likely to reoffend. their crime rates are lower across the board. And all of that has been accomplished without putting their prisoners through the most inhumane conditions possible. Importantly, their social programs are instrumental in making sure ex-convicts actually have realistic options other than turning to crime to survive after prison. But many Americans really dislike this system because it's not satisfying. The bad men aren't being punished enough. Importantly, special cases such as far-right terrorist Anders Breivik, who is pretty obviously not rehabilitated and seemingly intends to offend again, can receive extended sentences if a court decides it's appropriate, which they have, by the way. It's not like this system would have Jeffrey Dahmer back out on the street after a month. It's just not needlessly brutal, so it looks like a daycare compared to what we're used to seeing prisons as. I think far too often people hold up Scandinavian countries as these idealized progressive utopias, and they absolutely are not that. And in fact, Norway's prison system is nowhere near my first choice in how to handle the problem of crime. But it's an actually existing model that manages to be a hell of a lot more humane and effective without even being some radical abolitionist project. It's not actually that hard to not behave like the United States. We could all try it a little more. Until we shift the culture around prisons, torture like solitary confinement will continue, as well as the physical and sexual violence that plagues prisons, because safety and well-being just aren't serious considerations in an institution that, whether we formally admit it or not, is there to make people suffer. But the propaganda war that is raging around prison and punishment can sometimes obfuscate another important side of this issue. There is an economic interest in keeping torture in prisons. The United States Constitution permits forced labor, also known as slavery, if the person being subjected to it has been convicted of a crime. Nationally, incarcerated workers produce more than $2 billion per year in goods for state and private interests, and more than $9 billion per year in services for the maintenance of their prisons. They do this for literally pennies, and the work is typically not voluntary. So, say a prisoner refuses to go to work. They're already in jail, in conditions that, as we've covered, are already considered very harsh. What more can you do to them to compel them to work hard all day for basically nothing? Well, you can threaten them with a longer sentence, but that might not work. And with sentences being so long, for a lot of people, it might not make much of a difference. They're expecting to spend their lives there. So, you use torture. A report by the ACLU found that many prisoners were coerced into work under threat of solitary confinement. Here we see that solitary is being used in much the same way that the prison system itself is, to discipline and control workers. There's a reason critics of the prison system often discuss forced prison labor, and it's not just because of a moral opposition to it, but because it creates a financial incentive to keep as many people in prison for as long as possible. Economically, there's a lot of state and private institutions who benefit far more from keeping prisons full than keeping crime rates down. So again, in an environment like that, what do we expect to gain from observing that punitive prison practices like solitary confinement don't reduce crime, don't rehabilitate people? For a lot of the people in powerful positions who make decisions on how these institutions are run, that just has nothing to do with what prisons are for in their eyes. And as long as there are billions to be made from captive slave labor, don't be surprised if you find that incredibly wealthy people like Charles Koch, the only living Koch brother, can consistently find money to prop up right-wing media networks that will attack anyone attempting to reform the prison system. The ideological struggle in which we have to educate each other and build up our collective immunity to media fear-mongering about crime is directly intertwined with the economic struggle against the class that benefits from us being so afraid of each other that we foam at the mouth for longer and harsher sentences, which in effect means more captive labor, making more rich people even more money. Now, that might strike you as a despairing thought, But when I hear individual billionaires are dumping even more money into their little propaganda mouthpieces, like this guy, I get excited. People like Coke wouldn't feel the need to do that unless they felt their grasp on the culture slipping. And it is. Support for defunding police and using that money to actually fund social programs that reduce crime has never been higher. 10 years ago, that kind of thing just wasn't in the public discourse at all. Now these right-wing figureheads whose job it is to manufacture consent for carceral politics are acting as if it's already happened, attributing any perceived increase in crime to the supposed defunding of police departments that has not been implemented anywhere. Even the prevalence of the idea has these people scared, and to be clear, it is still not a majority-held opinion. But it used to be almost an impossible opinion to have, and now it's not. Likewise, opposition to the long sentences in American prisons is growing. A majority of surveyed adults now oppose three-strike laws which were used to enormously extend sentence lengths. The war on drugs is now overwhelmingly seen as a disaster. 66% of Americans support eliminating criminal penalties for drug possession and reinvesting drug enforcement resources into treatment and addiction services. 64% support repealing mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes, and 61% support commuting or reducing the sentences of people incarcerated for drugs. It can be slow, it can be very uneven, as we've seen, but people are figuring out that this way of doing things isn't producing results anyone is happy with. The summer of 2020 was a dramatic rupture. But in truth, it was also part of a continuum of growing public consciousness. That's why the rich are throwing money at ideologues tasked with reducing that consciousness. And that is why it's never been more important for us to educate ourselves and those around us as best we can. It doesn't have to be this way.